Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined again by Master Sanders, and here we are to discuss what is the Christian's relationship to the police in light of the last few months of rioting and protesting, defunding the police. We sort of have a lack of clarity amongst the leaders in the Christian church and Christian parachurch organizations, telling us what we ought to view, how we ought to view the police. So this is really more directed at left-wing strains of Christianity. But let's sort of begin with the problem. The problem is that in the United States, both Christians who have a more left-leaning bent and Christians that have a more right-leaning bent, the idea of the police and the federal government as being increasingly held in derision and disrespect is on the rise. So on the left, they'll tend to look at unions or non-governmental agencies like NGOs as a superior form of organization to which they give their primary loyalty. And then on the right, with the rise of libertarian thinking, private institutions, like corporations and things like that. And so you kind of get this from both ends of the spectrum, this idea that the police are not only, not effective, which they may or may not be, but they're immoral in their very existence and should be replaced either by, people's militias of internal security or private contractors. And the problem here is that neither private institutions nor non-governmental global institutions are ordained by Scripture. What is ordained by Scripture is the state. If we look at Romans 13, Paul tells us what the limits of the state and what it ought to do. He says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and therefore whoever resists them will bring judgment upon themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's messenger to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on those who practice evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And the Apostle Peter repeats this idea in 1 Peter 2:17. And the thing is that the state, or the civil magistrate, is ordained by Scripture in both Old and New Testaments, and private institutions are not, and non-governmental globalist institutions are not either. So this whole framing of the question is wrong. And so when you hear people say, well, if you don't want to get attacked by the police or shot, then don't resist arrest. Well, that's actually correct. If you are a Christian, do not resist arrest. And these things won't happen. So regardless of whether it's a cost-benefit analysis, it's for the sake of conscience. And I think that this really hasn't been talked about a lot, and it's becoming a big problem.
It really is. And so I think if we're going to look at any New Testament passage regarding the Christian's relation to the state, we have to understand it within its historical context. So it's almost academic in a way, the way a lot of Christians on both the left and the right approach government. If they look at what the Bible says at all about government, I think people on both sides, but especially the right, tend to have this idea that the Christians have an obligation to sort of save the state or redeem the state through the church, and that's not quite, I wouldn't say it's quite the New Testament norm either, but also I don't think that resistance to the state is taught in the Bible either, as you mentioned. But the ultimate thing is anything that we have to understand about the New Testament level on the state is to understand it within the context of the Roman Empire. So when Paul talks about let everyone be subject to the higher authorities, he's not just talking about, the city of, Minneapolis's council or the United States government. Paul was talking about the Roman Empire, which was a fairly brutal regime, one that laid waste to surrounding cultures and civilizations in the name of Roman conquest, and one that had subjugated and would go on to subjugate Christians in the following decades and centuries. When Paul is saying that we ought to give tribute to whom tribute is due, that is in response again to the Roman Empire, which was the governing authority at that time. And remember, Paul was writing this in his letter to the Romans, right? Romans 13. So that gives it a little more weight than we often would think. So what Paul is telling us is that we are not called to resist the state. We are called, in fact, to obey those in authority, even if we might disagree with those in authority or might be chafed by it, because the ultimate purpose of the state is to punish evil, as you mentioned. And too often times, a lot of Christians will claim that God is their authority, and they'll use that to circumvent what the Bible clearly says when it comes to earthly authority, whether it's our parents or whether it's the government or what have you. But the thing is, they make a mockery of that. If we truly believe, if God is truly our Lord of our life, then we're going to do what he tells us to do in his word and not try to use him as a shield to avoid our obligations to our God-given authorities.
Exactly. And if we look at the way Romans 13 has been used, a couple of ways of which it has been used, which is really sort of undercutting the entire thrust of the passage, is that one, Christians ought to do whatever the state says to do, just to go along with it, just to support it, not make waves. And another interpretation might be that, well, Christians need to take over the government to then use the sword for justice, because how can a pagan use the sword justly? As to the latter one first, well, Paul was writing about a pagan empire, and so Paul had no envisionment of Christians as the head of the civil magistrate. So clearly, the sort of rhetorical device, well, how can a pagan provide justice? Well, Paul thought they could. Take it up with him. Second of all, just going along with whatever the state says is not what it meant either. And what it actually means is to, not be a troublemaker, not be unduly ungovernable by the civil authorities, not giving the civil authorities any legitimate complaint against you. Whereas these other interpretations of Romans 13, what they end up giving is the state a complaint against you. So Romans 13 has been used more often than not to do the exact opposite of what Paul clearly intended, i.e. that you don't provoke the state beyond need. What you might provoke it is, fulfilling the gospel, which can get you into trouble. But beyond that, don't go out of your way to provoke the state. And we see with a lot of the more of the left-wing Christians who sort of take a civil disobedience perspective, that's a direct contravening of the spirit of Romans 13. Paul is not saying go out and protest and cause trouble and make it, create as many headaches for the civil magistrate as possible. And again, this is the civil magistrate that will eventually kill Paul. So, you can't say, oh, Paul writes this from comfort and security. No, this regime will actually eventually kill him. And in that sense, he practices what he preaches.
Well, exactly. And here's another thing too. Since we're talking about the issue of law enforcement, what was the primary means of law enforcement during that day, during Paul's day? Well, I'm sure there were local constabularies, if they could ever be considered as such, but for the most part, Roman law was enforced through the Roman army. And so it wouldn't surprise me if certain things were done when it came to law enforcement through the Roman soldiery. So that gives us a bigger perspective as to what our obligations to the state are. You got to keep in mind that this would be the same today if the regular army were our police, at least here in the United States, and we're nowhere near that. When it comes to law enforcement, even with all the worries about the militarization of the police. That's got to be kept in mind. Let's say, like in Matthew 5:41, when Jesus says, "Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2." A lot of translations put this within the context of a soldier. if it was not uncommon for soldiers to expropriate the labor of local civilians to do menial tasks if need be, which as Americans we have never really experienced that in the same way that other cultures have. But that gives it a new meaning. So if, let's say, in that day, if somebody were to tell you to carry his pack for about a mile, he could extract that much out of you. Well, Jesus says to go the extra mile. If in the same phrase that if somebody asks you to borrow your cloak, give them your tunic also. Which all that to me is to say within the context of the New Testament in regards to ethics, is that the moral righteousness of the state or the brutality of the state does not affect our obligations to the state when it comes to respecting the law. Even if, it's inconvenient for a soldier to force you to carry something or to do something for him. And yes, you could perhaps argue it's unjust. But nevertheless, we still have that obligation to the state because the state, in that sense, is our God-given authority. And in that instance, and unfortunately, again, when I see left-wing Christians complain about the state of the police today, and what should be done about the police, it's almost like a first world problem compared to the experiences of the first century church at the time that the Gospels and Paul's letters were being written.
Yeah, exactly. And while they might differ on what would occasion such an activity, in North America, Christians on the right and the left both sort of have this hashtag resist mindset, where whenever they think the government is doing something that it shouldn't, whether it should or shouldn't be doing that is sort of immaterial at this point, they always default to this hashtag resist mindset, where if the police, like you think of like on the right, there's like the 3%ers, that will really, make it miserable for the police to do their job on their end. And then you got left-wing Christians on the other end making it miserable for them to do theirs. And furthermore, if you resist arrest, if you resist the police, you are resisting Christ. That's what Paul says. So the people who default to this hashtag resist don't, and they do it rather glibly too. They haven't seriously thought about what they're doing, because you can't do that if you've seriously thought about it, because then you've realized that you've resisted Christ.
Well, and so we do whenever we resist any authority in our lives. And I see often with Christians is that Christians are often, and this is not unique to the left. I've seen right-wing Christians do this too. This mentality of trying to find caveats and trying to get around, I think, what the Bible actually says about this issue. And while we're talking about the difference between the right and the left was doing very similar things during the Obama administration, which, maybe not to this, obviously not to the point of rioting in the same way that you see now with the left, but there still was this sort of antagonistic mindset toward the state that you saw in the growth of certain right-wing militias and things like that. And again, we're not really, we're not called to fight the state because, again, as bad as the state may be, the state is still God's instrument for righteousness. And it amounts to rejecting the authority of Christ when we try to find ways and caveats around our obligations to the state. I've seen this in many cases with children and their parents. Again, these are ostensibly Christians that would try to find ways around what their parents told them to do and say, like, well, I'm just doing this within the will of God, or God said that I could do this, and that my loyalty to God trumps any earthly authority. The problem is the earthly authority in your life is God-given. And to resist a God-given authority is, in essence, to resist Christ, as you mentioned. And this is a very much a black mark on both the right and the left, because what this does is that it invites further recriminations from the state later on, and they will soon find out that they can't trust Christians, which will be more detrimental for any of us later down the road.
Exactly. And this attitude, again, having set the stage about the Roman Empire, this autocratic, authoritarian, brutal regime that won't hesitate to massacre entire population centers for rising up against them, puts the current debate about police brutality in context to the point where it's laughable. I mean, it's inconceivable to imagine the U.S. police force doing anything like what the Romans did casually to put down uprisings. So, for example, when they defeated Spartacus, they crucified all the slaves half the length of Italy from Rome to the heel. So something like that is just inconceivable today in the United States. And the early Christians as well, who were, of course, martyred by the civil magistrate, also held similar attitudes. From the martyrdom of Polycarp, we read, I am a Christian, and if you wish to hear the Christian doctrine, appoint me a time and hear me. The proconsul answered, persuade the people. Polycarp replied, to you I have thought it right to give account. For we have been taught to give to rulers and the powers ordained of God such fitting honor as heretofore not our souls, but them deem not worthy that I should defend myself before them. Now, what's interesting here about Polycarp is that he treats the rabble and the people as less than worthless. They're just dogs. He doesn't care about them at all. They don't even deserve a response. And notice he's saying this to the centurion, who is going to proceed to then burn him at the stake. And so this sort of what I call, populism fagging on the left. Oh, always take the side of the mob. Always take the side of the people. Well, again, that's not what we see with the earliest Christians. After all, it was a mob that offered Jesus up to Pilate to be executed. It was a mob that sought to besiege Paul before his sister's son warned the centurion of the plot against them. And then we read in Ignatius, who would again be martyred under the Emperor Trajan, be subject to Caesar in everything, in which subjection implies no spiritual danger. Provoke not those that rule over you to wrath, that you may give no occasion against yourself to those who seek you for it. So, and we see that both of these men were murdered by the Roman state. Now, obviously, the argument is, people are going to argue, well, weren't Paul and the church fathers a bunch of cucks? Why didn't they stand up for, themselves? Why support the civil magistrate? Well, because in what Calvinists would often call a common blessing, or this common grace that God gives all of mankind, in order to do your daily business, is one of those things that Christians and non-Christians alike get. And the reason why the civil magistrate is ordained by God is because it is the only institution throughout history, again and again, whose, if you will, mandate is to provide for that. And so even in the short term, if the civil magistrate is acting in a tyrannical fashion or in an undue fashion, it preserves the public safety better than anything else. I mean, compared to what? Do you think, East India companies ravaging, the South Asian regions would do it better? Do you think the UN, which can't even frickin' police, Sinai during the 60s, or many of these African countries like Sierra Leone? I mean, it's a clear disaster having the UN be a police force. And it's a disaster having private security be a police force. As bad as it can get, the civil magistrate is the best means by which one can ensure the public good. And it's been the case again and again and again. And it's no accident that every deviation from that has been relatively short-lived and catastrophic in its failure.
Well, exactly. And I do find it interesting that both the right and the left, with their sort of hobby horses, the left being international non-government organizations, and the libertarian right with their, and in some cases, like in David French, almost ridiculous defense of corporate power, or at least or corporate autonomy. What they don't realize is that both of those in Revelation are the instruments of the Antichrist. The Antichrist one world empire, probably through something like the UN. And of course, Babylon is described as a city of great commerce. And so that's probably a little off topic than what we're getting at, but I do find that interesting. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The state, the purpose of the state is, as Paul mentions, is that we can live peaceably, and we can do what we can do when it comes to our ministry without having to worry about the chaos that's in our neighborhoods. Americans are already finding out real quick what happens with no police force, with no state. Minneapolis is going to get a rude awakening soon if it hasn't had already. And you're also going to see these in other cities where they're entertaining defunding the police and others because of the chaos that ensues. And this order that we take for granted every day is going to go to pot. And I think Christians are doing are not doing their fellow man a favor by encouraging this level of anarchy. I can't understand like why Christians would try to actively undermine a force that's meant for our good and call that Christian. And it's not just the issue of rebellion, but think about your neighbor. Do I really love my neighbor if I want to make the circumstances much more easier for his house to be looted and for him to possibly be killed? I think not. Which again, it is the state that allows us to have one less distraction when it comes about ministering our work. And going back to this idea of pagans administering the sword, God did that quite a bit throughout history. In fact, he typically punished Israel through such means. During the judge period, where you had their neighbors that would occupy their territory and terrorize them, but also, of course, with the Assyrians taking away the northern kingdom later, and the Babylonians the southern kingdom. And so God has used the nations throughout the years to bring about justice. And so I think whether you look at that from an Old or New Testament perspective, I really don't see any grounds for us to actively resist the state if we are convinced the state is acting unjustly.
Exactly. And furthermore, which would solidify this interpretation of how the Christian ought to relate to the civil authorities, in Acts 23, when Paul is under house arrest and his sister son warns the centurion, we read, so when Paul's sister son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring you this young man to you. He has something to say." And the commander took him by the hand, went aside, and asked privately, "What is it you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and command him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." So we see that aiding and assisting the police up to a point is laudatory in the New Testament. You're not going to find anybody in the Old or the New Testament who actively thwart the civil magistrate being praised. And Paul's sister's son in the economy of salvation helps Paul avoid a premature death and allows him to finish his ministry. So whereas many left-wing Christians would have sided with the 40 men that swore an oath not to eat or drink to kill Paul.
Well, that's true. That's true. And so again, God can. Well, okay. This brings up another important question. Going back to the issue on the right. These COVID measures have, to be frank, been very scary when it comes to our liberties and some of the bridges that have been crossed. I think we can agree on that. The problem is, how far should Christians obey these measures, especially if it's clear that the government is antagonistic toward them and toward them specifically? In places like California, I think that's fairly obvious, where casinos and other places can be open, but churches can't. And so that actually presents a very interesting problem. Now, John MacArthur, who I believe, wasn't it MacArthur that actually said the American Revolution was not justified biblically?
Yes.
Okay, so that put that in perspective. So, of course, he's coming from the biblical perspective of rebelling against ordained authorities, which in the case of them, they thought that their liberties were being threatened by the British government. So with that in mind, he's now been in the sort of ongoing legal battle with the state of California and with Los Angeles to open his church, Grace Community, for regular attendance. And so far, it's been pretty ugly. Not when it comes to some of the tit for tat that the state government and local governments are engaged in, and that actually presents a very interesting problem. Which, if the government is telling us not to meet, and it's clear that it's not just for everybody, it's clearly arbitrary, then what ought we to do? Now, This is admittedly something I have not quite figured out on my own. But one thing I would say is that if we are forced to resist the state, it really should be when all other options are gone. And by obeying the state, we would be disobeying God. Now, I think on the surface, it looks like in the case of Grace Community that we ought to meet, as Hebrews says, we ought to meet as much as we can, which we shouldn't forsake. But at the same time, I don't think that anything would be keeping them from meeting in groups. If the state of California were trying to disband Grace Community Church, then I think that would be one thing. But that's not quite what the state is doing. I do think that there are ways that they can get around and enjoy fellowship with each other, perhaps maybe in groups or in their homes, without necessarily having to all meet at the same place. And my fear is with this case is that it's going to cross too many lines to the point where it would be easier for future governments to ignore the pleas of churches when it comes down to when their liberties clearly are in danger.
Yeah, this gets back to, well, of course, what Paul said. Why ought we not to resist the civil authorities? Because they're there to ensure the peace. And so if we disrupt the peace, or even more fundamentally, as with defund the police, remove the ability for the federal government or the state government to even enforce the peace at all, then we don't have peace. And I think, riffing off what you said about first world problems, looking at how badly the Christians suffered at the hands of the Roman state and how brutal security measures were, looking at where we live now, where we have, posse comitatus, which prevents the soldiers from policing with the police unless it's a martial law situation. The idea that we have a trial by jury, that we have the Fifth Amendment, and that we can plead the Fifth. We have all of these things that Christians never had. We should still, even at this late hour, rather be thankful of the things that we still have, rather than abolishing the very system itself. And certainly appealing to all of these legal mechanisms that are available to us is completely permissible. Paul did the same thing when he was flogged by the Romans. He said, "Are you going to flog a citizen without a trial?" Which got them really scared, and they're like, "Uh-oh, we goofed up here." So having all these things for our benefit that we have as a result of Anglo-Saxon common law, we should rather be thankful that we still have it at all, rather than rapidly losing it, which will certainly happen once we abolish the police. And the other thing is, what is going to replace the police? It's not like these law enforcement officers and personnel are not going to be doing law enforcement. That's what they're trained in. What they're going to do is they're going to be private security forces. And those individuals are not going to be under the jurisdiction of the voters. We're not going to be able to vote out the commander of the internal security forces that are privatized, whereas we might be able to if it was a police union and the guy served 4 years. We lost that. It's gone now. And now it's an unaccountable arm of the corporate power structure. And so in many ways, I guess you could say this is a revenge of the libertarian right, and the left is hoisting itself on its own petard by getting rid of these. But we'll quickly see that these private security will be much less desirable than the sort of civil police force that we currently have.
Exactly. And that's often what happens when we do try to resist God-given authorities in our lives, is that we often do hoist ourselves on by our own petard, which in the case of the left, you're right, they've only created the atmosphere by which corporate power could be furthered, and by extension, state power could be furthered. A lot of people don't realize is that the state tends to grow in times of chaos. The best way to ensure against an overreaching state is to have a self-regulating populace, one that's willing to enforce enforce morality, enforce order, and that would negate the necessity of a police force. But nevertheless, what tends to happen is that when governments feel threatened, when governments are having to deal with more and more chaos, that justifies the growth of the state, and it justifies the state coming further down on those that are actively resisting it and creating chaos. And so what the left is doing, and the right to a certain extent has as well, is that they are creating the atmosphere for further brutality and further oppression. And this is the same thing that we've seen in other cultures throughout time. And I think we could very well see it in the present if things like this keep happening.
Well, exactly. And the other element to all of this as well is that both Christians on the right and the left have too easily been seduced by the idea that using state power or revolutionary violence or some sort of direct action, if you will, is the way you make changes happen. The kinds of changes that we want to see happen. And that's how you do it. And when we look at history, how the long lasting changes that we still cherish happen, it's not through these kinds of radical, violent, outlandish behavior, but the slow, steady pace of a Christian witness. So, for example, the separation of church and state and the freedom to practice religion as you see fit in the United States was the result not of revolutionary insurrection, but the sort of steady witness of Baptists and Quakers like Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and William Penn in Pennsylvania, and other groups that were fleeing Europe. And so by creating this precedent in the first place, it was a desirable precedent that others sought to imitate and continue. And, this, I think, gets back to a more fundamental wisdom of the founders when John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, wrote that the sort of liberties that we cherish as Americans are best preserved not by intervention and revolution, but by a witness, by the witness of the institutions themselves, by the witness of that way of life itself. And what we see everywhere is the collapse of that way of life. And resorting to direct action, revolution, and strong-arm tactics is only speeding up that process.
Well, and that goes in the case of any relationship we have with our authorities, is that the best way that we can be a witness and institute change is through our witness, through the way we live. And that includes things such as submitting to authority. That includes things such as turning the other cheek. That includes such things as loving our enemies. Things that don't fit within the logic of this world. But those sorts of things are what inspire change. Like exactly what you mentioned in the United States, which was neither the Baptists nor the Quakers nor other dissenting groups in the United States sought a violent revolution against the established authorities. In places like Virginia, Baptists were Baptist ministers were seriously persecuted because of their faith and because of the threat that they represented to the establishment. But you never saw anybody like a John Leland or John Ireland or any of these other Baptist ministers argue for a insurrection against the state. They never said that the planter class should be overthrown. Nevertheless, they continued to preach with boldness even in prison and even from the position of prison. Their obedience to God was never a justification for violence. And slowly over time, people began to notice the plight of the Baptists, people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, people who were in the planter class, and they were won over and became in many ways test cases for religious liberty throughout the United States. So as Christians, I think we get a lot more attention, not through our, and I mean positive attention, not through our resistance to authority, not through creating things difficult for the state and for our neighbors, but rather through our witness, by the way we demonstrate our love, by the way we respond to persecution, by the way we respond to injustice in our lives. And that's what creates, I think, the goodwill that's needed for the change that happens. And even with the Roman Empire, Christians did not rise up against the empire and take it over. Nevertheless, Christianity, whether you say that the Constantinian synthesis was a good thing or not, nevertheless, Christianity was able to gain far more influence on a cultural and even political level, thanks to the fact that they, for about 200 or 300 years, they were constantly persecuted and never engaged in full-scale uprising. Now, the converse of that is Japan. Japan, during the 17th century, had a very large and thriving Catholic population that very well could have become the dominant religion in Japan given enough time. But because the tax system in shogunate era Japan was quite brutal and quite oppressive, you had a number of different peasants that led a revolt against the Japanese central government, and that included large numbers of Catholics. And that was just the excuse the shogunate needed to wipe out Catholicism in Japan, to the point where Christianity has rarely had any influence in Japan for almost 400 years. With only 1% proclaiming any level of Christian devotion. And that's pretty small compared to, say, someplace like South Korea or China. So that's going to be, I think, this example of our witness and how we approach persecution and we approach trials and tribulations, that is going to be the means in which we bring about social change, and not through taking up active arms or active resistance against what is otherwise a God-given authority.
Yeah. This reminds me of 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if, because of conscience towards God, one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is it if you, when beaten for your faults, take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So, Peter's saying if you get punished for doing wrong, well, and you take it, well, then, I mean, what do you want? A gold star? I mean, that's to be expected. It's when those in authority, in this case the slave master, but could as well be the civil magistrate, is being unjust, that it finds commendation from God. And you could argue, Master Sanders, that the success of the religious liberty movement by the patient suffering of the Baptists was the bearing of fruit of God's commendation of their suffering in the face of injustice.
I would say so. And since we're on the subject of the sort of pacifism, I often think that Christians, especially in light of the example of Martin Luther King, tend to put civil disobedience in the same category as sort of a pacifistic resistance. The problem with civil disobedience and most civil disobedience movements is that they actively seek to disrupt, maybe not the state, but the workings of society. We see this with the extinction movement today, where in places like Britain, they've jumped on top of trains, they blocked roads, and some of these things have even resulted in violence. I've never understood why people think that will actually earn them goodwill. In fact, if anything, it'll earn people's annoyance and hatred. If you're viewed as the people that are keeping them from doing their job or making life difficult for them, they're not going to view you very favorably. And I do think some of the tactics, you could argue that, like, well, a lot of Martin Luther King's tactics worked. I mean, to a certain extent they did, but this also led to, inspired violence in other parts of the country once the movement moved outside the South. Even today, we still are feeling some of the worst aspects of it when it comes to racial animosity with each other. So I would say that, yeah, not even King or Gandhi style civil disobedience is necessarily the way forward either, because even if we don't take up active arms against the state, it can still produce a lot of unneeded resentment toward Christians, to the point where people won't really want to have anything to say to us because they associate us with people who are actively disrupting their lives.
Yeah. This sort of gets at what the author of Hebrews says, and I think it's chapter 8. If at all possible, live at peace with all men, and of course that's actively antagonizing people, right? It's this sort of idea that civil disobedience of this sort of like passive aggressive kind is compatible with a broader pacifism ethic. It's sort of like violating the spirit but keeping to the letter, because the point of this is it's more fundamental than even the application of force. It's being being the kind of person that is willing to get along with other people. It's being like Isaac, that when the Philistines try to take your well, you keep on moving till you find a well that they don't want. Sure, they're being treacherous. Sure, they're violating their word towards you. But he didn't rise up and fight the Philistines. He just kept on moving until he found a place where they were going to leave him alone. Just like Abraham sought his dispute with Lot the same way. He said, Lot, you decide. And of course, Lot, being selfish, took the best land, but in the end, the best land was his own undoing. So, but it's you can't say that on paper. Oh yeah, I didn't throw a punch, but you're actively antagonizing the person the whole time. That still is a violation of the spirit of the gospel.
Well, I don't see how even a passive aggressive stance could be said that it's done in love. You know, Jesus tells us to love our neighbor. Jesus tells us to love our enemy. And that is perhaps very hard and counterintuitive when it comes to living as a Christian. So I don't really see, again, how this sort of passive aggressive manner fits in within this ethic of love. If anything, as you said, that creates more antagonism, more difficulties for us later. And that is, people see that. That's the thing. People see that. They're not going to give you points necessarily for being, the fact that you're not taking up arms. They're still going to resent you for this. And it goes back to that the Christian life is very demanding and it's very rigorous, but it's one that's effective and one that's in line with Scripture. And I think the sad thing is that both Christians of a liberal and a conservative persuasion are active in their attempts to kind of live up to that letter, or at least right up to the letter, and then, as you said, ignore the spirit, which arguably is more important.
Yeah, exactly. And what happens when you have these sort of, rebellious, Samuel tells Saul that rebellion is of the sin of witchcraft. And so if you rebel against the civil magistrate, and therefore against Christ, that is as akin to the sin of witchcraft. And the other thing too is that one of the reasons, let's lay for aside the sort of scriptural gospel reasons why you want to do this. Let's look at the more pragmatic reason. If you make everybody hate you and you create more and more ill will with other people around you, then you eventually will have to pay that price. Maybe not you directly, maybe your offspring, maybe your grandchildren, but somebody in your team, your camp, is going to pay for this, and it's going to be really bad. And what I think is going to happen, sadly, is that as Christianity continues to diminish in influence in North America, precisely because it seeks to become indistinguishable from the world itself, eventually there will be a tipping point where I think both Christians on the right and on the left will get some comeuppance from people that have a long memory of everything they were doing since the 1960s. And one could argue that they should have seen this coming. They should have seen that, and openly antagonizing people is not the way to win friends and influence others. And furthermore, are you really in a position to win an armed struggle? Probably not. Very few people in the United States who, even if they do possess firearms, are competent to use them. And least of all in a prolonged, protracted struggle of a revolutionary nature. So you're not even playing to your strengths, right? It's not only immoral in denying Christ, it's also stupid because it's not playing to your strengths. The strength of the sort of politically disconnected or the sort of outcast or the sort of physically weak party is to rely on a sort of moral authority, a real moral authority. And we see throughout history that Christianity's greatest successes have been rooted in standing on that moral authority and winning the affairs of others. Because even the strongest man can be overtaken by a mob. Every empire eventually creates enough enemies that they team up and topple it. The Roman Empire eventually was toppled by a coalition of tribes that eventually were able to gain the upper hand in this struggle. And there's no way that you can take them all on at once. Whereas, what if you create a situation where you don't have to? You create a situation where you don't have to take them all at once, precisely because they don't want to attack you. So far from being cucks and not standing up for their rights like Paul and the early church fathers. It is a long-term strategy playing to the strengths of the weaker party, which it would seem invariably a consistent application of gospel principles would reduce you to, weaker at least in the physical sense, but stronger in the moral sense. And by appealing to that, which isn't really being done anymore, Christians would be much more secure in their own homes. And in fact, Christianity, even amongst non-Christians, used to be held in high esteem in the United States. It used to be, in the theme of Hollywood films, that saints and martyrs and Christian witness was upheld and praised as noble, even for those who maybe themselves weren't Christian. And while we can certainly argue that there were enemies from without conspiring against the Christian faith, Christians from within have certainly not done their due diligence to not give them any extra reasons to come after or invent slanders against Christians.
Well, exactly. The thing is, we will always have enemies. Like Christianity will always have enemies simply because God always has enemies. But the thing is, are we creating enemies for God, or are we winning friends for God? In which you're right. Going back to overestimating your ability to resist the state, I think it was California Congressman Eric Swalwell, in rather cringy statement against the NRA, was saying, well, the federal government has nukes, right? So this idea that you can be able to resist the government with shotguns and AR-15s or anything like that is just ludicrous. Now, again, it was rather cringy, but at the same time, like, he's absolutely right. So what do the resist crowd, whether they be right-wing militias or left-wing ones, especially in this day and age with such advances in technology, think that they can do to actively resist the state? And you're right, a lot of people overestimate their abilities to act in a time of crisis. Now, even with take even the police, for example, since we're talking about them. When the police engage in what can result in deadly results in fighting people who are resisting and actively resisting, these are people who are trained, right? So these are people who are trained to act this way in this situation, and and even then, they don't always. Things can get out of control for them, so they can't always control the outcome. And so this idea that whether it's a 60-year-old boomer with his AR-15, or it's a 20-year-old neat LARPer with his Molotov cocktail, if any of them think that they could, in a long term, win against the state, I mean, it's just absolutely laughable. And so, with that in mind, as Christians, why would we seek to antagonize those people that could destroy us with deadly force if we don't have to? If we're going to be martyrs, then fine. That's, so be it. But we shouldn't be martyrs because we brought it on ourselves. We should be martyrs because we're doing what God has told us to do. And I think too often Christians don't even know what God has told them to do. So they're going to be martyrs, and whether they like it or not.
Well, exactly. And furthermore, looking at the Christian witness in the Roman Empire, and however you want to interpret Constantine, the Christianity sort of delivered a sort of fiat accompli to the Roman Empire that it had to do something. And you might say, well, look at all these martyrs that were killed. Yeah, well, name any violent insurrection that was successful. The two Jewish wars were failures. The rise of Boudica in England was a failure. The rise of the Arab queen Zenobia was a failure. The rise of the subjects of Illyricum was a failure. These are all failures. The Roman Empire did not fall from within, but from a conquest from without. So when it came to internal security mechanisms, nobody was going to overthrow the Roman Empire. So one could argue that Christianity did what all of these other resistance movements to the Roman Empire failed to do. They failed to overcome, they in some sense overcame the empire in a way that the Jewish zealots or Boudica or any of these other groups could only dream of. And so it's not like, you just die and take it from the state, or you fight and win. You usually fight and lose. the American Revolution was highly unusual in the annals of history of the established authority being overthrown. More often than not, the established authority wins, and established authorities generally fall due to external pressures. Again, Russian Revolution 1917, also highly unusual in the annals of history, where the internal revolt overthrows the Tsar and later the government of Kerensky. But I think too often people on the left think 1917 is normative, and people on the right think 1776 is normative, when neither one of those are normative. Those are extremely rare occurrences.
Very much so. And in the instance of the American Revolution, part of it, what made the British Empire fail in that regard was because, on the one hand, they had internal pressure from within. The war was very unpopular back home in Britain. And on the other hand, you had pressure from outside forces like France and Spain that forced Britain to eventually concede, especially with Yorktown, where it was only able to be accomplished thanks to the intervention of the French fleet. And of course, with 1917, arguably, Russia had just had so much internal rot from so many years of internal revolution and failure to catch up with the West that something like what happened in 1917 was inevitable. And of course, even then, with Christians getting involved in politics, which is messy to begin with, even if Christians are involved with something that's fairly benign by world standards, say like Kerensky in 1917, or with democratic movements in places like Iran following the end of the Shah. One thing that people don't often anticipate is that it's usually not the first revolution to worry about. It's the second one. It's the one that follows that often goes in a far more radical and scary direction. And what that does is that it makes the Christian who's actively involved in these revolts somewhat liable for the greater evil that follows it. So because when it comes to politics and war and things like that, that oftentimes things get out of control because of law of unintended consequences or whatever. I think that should give Christians pause to if they actively support movements that are undermining state authorities, and especially since that state authority already is ordained by God.
Exactly. We're about nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with, Master Sanders?
Well, yes, our ultimate loyalty is to God and not to man. But if we truly have loyalty to God, if we truly are going to obey God, we're going to do what he says. Right? And so we as Christians ruin our potential witness by actively engaging in movements that seek to undermine existing authorities that God has given us in our lives, whether that be through right-wing militias or left-wing mobs, because in the end, what we do is that we bring dishonor to Christ and we bring dishonor to ourselves, and that will justify, of course, in the future, people rejecting the gospel and ultimately persecuting us. I think as Christians, we should be very, very wary of connecting the cause of Christ with movements that ultimately, at their heart of it, are rebellions against God themselves.
Exactly. And I'll end with a citation from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. This is Ty Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.